So I just spotted Snail in my bedroom. He's right there. Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in this video, I'll be showing you where Snail hides from Season 3 of Blue's Clues. There are 26 episodes in Season 3, a lot more than from Seasons 1 and 2. So with further ado, let's get into the episodes. The first episode is Blue's Treasure Hunt. First, you can see Snail next to the flowers in the front yard when Steve sang the mail time song. Next, you can see Snail behind the left side of the toy chest when Steve looks for a scroll. And finally, you can see Snail next to the flowers when Steve and Blue went to meet Little Miss Muffet in the land of great discovery. The second episode is Art Appreciation. First, you can see Snail on top of the glitter jar on the art stand when Steve went over to the felt frame to see Padrius. Next, you can see Snail next to the sculpture stand when Steve skidooed into the art museum. And finally, you can see Snail next to one of the trees at the backyard art show. The third episode is Weight and Balance. First, you can see Snail behind the right side of the picture of Blue and in front of the red vase with 3 daisies on the small round table while Steve was going to the kitchen with the grocery bags. Next, you can see Snail behind the right side of the thinking chair when Steve sang the mail time song. And finally, you can see Snail behind the right side of the barrel when Steve skidooed into the country store. The fourth episode is What's That Sound? First, you can see Snail on the bottom stand of the tall lamp when Steve went to the porch. Next, you can see Snail in front of a rock next to the pond when Steve saw a frog in the pond. And finally, you can see Snail next to the projection screen stand when Steve sees Blue skidooed into the movie. The fifth episode is Animal Behavior. First, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve was pretending to be a chicken when he sang the mail time song. Next, you can see Snail behind the right side of a rock when Steve skidooed into the computer game. And finally, you can see Snail behind the left side of a rock when Steve skidooed out of the computer game. The sixth episode is Blue's Big Pajama Party. First, you can see Snail behind the right side of the toy chest when Steve went into the kitchen. And finally, you can see Snail behind the right side of the bed when Steve sang the quiet version of the So Long song. The seventh episode is Draw Along with Blue. First, you can see Snail as a drawing on a pencil holder when Steve went into the kitchen. Next, you can see Snail as a painting on a hanging picture when Blue skidooed into the chalkboard. And finally, you can see Snail as a drawing on the chalkboard when Steve skidooed out of the chalkboard. The eighth episode is Hide and Seek. First, you can see Snail under the snack table when Blue was trying to find Steve. Next, you can see Snail behind the right side of the thinking chair when Steve sang the mail time song and Mailbox hid behind the thinking chair. And finally, you can see Snail on the living room window from behind the right curtain when Steve skidooed out of the All About Blue book. The ninth episode is Thankful. First, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve was going over to the bedroom to show his Thankful book. Next, you can see Snail next to the Scarecrow when Steve was heading out before meeting up with Shovel and Pail. And finally, you can see Snail next to Side Table Drawer when Steve sang the We Just Figured Out Blue's Clues song. The 10th episode is Blue's Big Holiday. First, you can see Snail on a patch on the holiday quilt when Steve is showing the holiday quilt. Next, you can see Snail next to the snow globe when Steve and Blue skidooed into Toyland. And finally, you can see Snail between the two snowmen when Steve and Blue skidooed back to the living room. The 11th episode is Pool Party. First, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve was going to the bedroom to invite Tickety for the pool party. Next, you can see Snail on the bookcase before Blue and Steve skidooed into deck of cards. And finally, you can see Snail next to a red tulip when Steve, Blue, Slippery Soap, Tickety Talk, Shovel, Pail, Mailbox, Side Table Drawer, Mr. Salt, Mrs. Pepper, Paprika, Magenta, and the Jokers are having a pool party. The 12th episode is Anatomy. First, you can see Snail next to a small statue of a human body when Steve's heart is being up for the first clue, which is a mouth. Next, you can see Snail on the small round table between the kitchen and the living room to the right of the wooden mannequin when Steve was going to the kitchen. And finally, you can see Snail next to the arm grabbing machine when Steve skidooed back into the living room. The 13th episode is Signs. First, you can see Snail next to Side Table Drawer when Steve was going over to Blue. Next, you can see Snail when Steve sang the mail time song. And finally, you can see Snail on top of Side Table Drawer next to the telephone when Steve sang the We Just Figured Out Blue's Clues song. The 14th episode is Nature. First, you can see Snail to the left of the rock when Steve skidooed into into the Seasons book. Next, you can see Snail in front of the rock when Steve skidooed back home from the Seasons book. And finally, you can see Snail in front of the grass when Steve, Blue, Mr. Salt, Mrs. Pepper, Paprika, and Wendy were looking at the clouds. The 15th episode is Geography. First, you can see Snail between the two Hershey Kisses when Steve skidooed into the candy board game. Next, you can see Snail next to the grass where the purple popsicle is when Steve and Blue skidooed back home. And finally, you can see Snail behind the right of the pink book with a blue smiley face when Steve and Blue go into the library. The 16th episode is Occupations. First, you can see Snail behind the red face when Steve was looking for Mr. Salt, Mrs. Pepper, and Paprika. Next, you can see Snail on top of the stone building block when Steve and Blue skidooed into the construction site. And finally, you can see Snail behind the bush from the Doors construction site when Steve and Blue skidooed back home. The 17th episode is Blue's Big Mystery. First, you can see Snail behind the left side of the toy chest while Steve was looking for the first clue, which were paw prints. Next, you can see Snail behind the left side of the tree closest to the path in the fork in the road leading straight when Steve and Blue returned to the fork in the road to follow the trail of paw prints leading down after the other path led them to Gopher. And finally, you can see Snail behind the right side of Periwinkle's fort when Steve sings the So Long song. The 18th episode is Periwinkle Misses His Friend. First, you can see Snail under the left side of the snack table when Steve was going into the kitchen. Next, you can see Snail in front of the white fence when Steve, Blue, and Periwinkle skidooed back from the city. And finally, you can see Snail on the left side of the red bench when Periwinkle made a card and mails it to his friend Plum. The 19th episode is What's So Funny. First, you can see Snail next to the flower pot when Steve and Blue skidooed into Silly Town. Next, you can see Snail next to the bathtub when Steve and Blue skidooed back into the bedroom. And finally, you can see Snail next to the purple drawer after Steve drew the third clue, which was a ball. The 20th episode is Blue's Big Costume Party. First, you can see Snail next to the flower pot when Steve and Blue skidooed back to the living room. Next, you can see Snail on the right side of side table drawer when Steve sang the We Just Figured Out Blue's Clue song. And finally, you can see Snail next to the Halloween goodie bag when Steve, Blue, Magenta, Slippery, and Boo were playing the costume limbo game. The 21st episode is Inventions. First, you can see Snail next to a red tulip when Steve went over to shovel Pale and Blue in the backyard. Next, you can see Snail next to a open room when Steve skidooed into the Invention room. And finally, you can see Snail next to the table when Steve skidooed back to the living room from the Invention room. The 22nd episode is Blue's Play. First, you can see Snail next to side table drawer when Steve invites the viewers inside. Next, you can see Snail in the plant when Steve finds the first clue, which was a mouse. And finally, you can see Snail at the fence when Steve and Blue skidooed into Blue's colleague. The 23rd episode is Prehistoric Blue. First, you can see Snail behind the left side of the tree with a daffodil and a daisy between its central and right roots when Steve went over to see the dinosaur footprints. Next, you can see Snail behind the left side of the signpost in the dinosaur diorama that leads back to the living room when Steve skidooed into the dinosaur diorama. And finally, you can see Snail behind the left side of the toy chest when Steve skidooed out of the dinosaur diorama. The 24th episode is The Wrong Shirt. First, you can see Snail next to the lamp when Steve and Blue skidooed into an opposites book. Next, you can see Snail on the black line when Steve and Blue skidooed back home. And finally, you can see Snail next to side table drawer when Steve sings the So Long song. The 25th episode is Words. First, you can see Snail next to the trash can when Steve went to the kitchen to meet up with Mr. Salt, Mrs. Pepper, and Paprika. Next, you can see Snail next to the trash can before Steve and Blue skidooed into a blank piece of paper. And finally, you can see Snail next to a party streamer when Blue turned the word party into a party. And finally, the 26th episode is Shy. First, you can see Snail next to the vase with 3 daisies between the living room and kitchen when Steve was looking for the first clue, which was a bag. Next, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sang the Mealtime song. And finally, you can see Snail next to the water fountain when Blue and Steve skidooed into Blue's school. So those are all the episodes of Where Snail Hides from Season 3 of Blue's Clues. So hope you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.